Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I'm Dean Walker, the host of that podcast. And this is a kind of an unusual episode. This is actually me posting somebody else's interview of me on their relatively new podcast. It's David Baum, his podcast of Collapse Club. David and I met in both of us volunteering in the Deep Adaptation community. And David did an interview with me in an earlier iteration of his podcast work a few months ago. And I posted it on mine because he thought it was a complete and utter loss, just something he couldn't post in his own world. So I posted it in mine. I'll be happy to post the link to that earlier podcast interview in the show notes for this one. What I really just want to acknowledge is just how different David's interview of me was, and out of that, how different it felt to respond to his questions. And I would invite you to check out both of these interviews and just compare them for both of our words and demeanor and presence. It's really meant to be just an example of a couple of human beings doing the best we can through a number of really extraordinarily challenging circumstances that we're all in, and especially those of us in the Collapse Aware community who are producing, whether it's coursework or videos or interviews and so on. We can find ourselves impacted by stress behavior with everybody else. It's just, there's a lot of that going around. So my hat's off to David Baum for his remarkable, obvious personal growth commitment in these months, and how much he invited a different part of me out in this interview. And so I just really appreciate his stylistic flair of doing interviews, and the presence that he brought forth and invited from me in this particular interview as well. So enjoy. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Collapse Club, where we talk about how we are to live in a world that is collapsing. Today, I am with my friend, Dean Walker from Medford, Oregon. Dean is a teacher and an author who has created an answer to the question of how we are to live. Welcome, Dean.
Hi, it's great to be with you, David.
One of your principal ideas is about reconnection. Could you talk about what that means to you, please?
Yeah, be happy to. In the putting together of my book about this collapse stuff you're talking about, back in 2017, The Impossible Conversation, the question that I kept trying to answer just for my own sanity was what got us into this predicament that I believe we're in globally. And the answer kept coming back that we've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning and relationship in a human life. And that for ease of conversation, I broke that down into connection with deeper self, with each other, with earth, and with soul. And so if I could say that there's something at the biggest center point of my work that I offer to others, and my own practices, by the way, is practices of reconnection. That no matter what you might see out on the horizon, whatever your existential choices are as we face collapse, which I think is a vitally important choice that all of us need to make for ourselves. I'm just suggesting that each person will gather together their own practices that help them reconnect in each of those areas. So that's the nutshell of how reconnection lives in this body of work.
And you call it living resilience. What's the meaning of that term?
Well, I don't know how else to put it. In the face of predicament, which implies no apparent solution, I needed to find words that somehow spoke to the aliveness that's possible as an alternative to the despair and the fear and the resignation that can happen, the polarization that can happen in that is happening around the globe. You know, we can all point very easily to the examples of how we're disconnected from other people, from the earth, and so on. If we just look through the frame of what we've all grown up with, how business as usual works and what's possible other than this business as usual ecocidal paradigm, there aren't options. Really, we either get to keep doing business as usual and hoping for the best, or we can be in despair and fear and confusion because there's no innate option offered to us in that model. So I'm talking about living like, is there a possibility? Here's the question. If not that despair and that fear and so on, then what? And
well, that's a good question. You talk about aliveness.
yeah.
And where do we look for a sense of aliveness in the face of what is increasingly bad news, multiplying and expanding beyond anything we could have imagined?
Yeah. Well, if we could imagine just a simple 3-tiered staircase, I've simplified it as best I can because that's how I work best, and people can understand it a bit more. So at the entry level of, the first level of resilience skills that we might be able to have in the face of what's going on, I call that first aid level. So if our city has been devastated by a hurricane and we're huddled together with other families in the high school gym and we're trying to figure out how will we put our lives back together, that's the level of resilience skills at the first aid level. And they're very, very basic. They're literally just what helps us stay present in our body instead of dissociating, which that often happens for people in disaster settings. There's
survival skills.
Yeah, and survival resilience skills, like how can I be resilient? How can I return myself to some sense of familiarity, of center, so that I can be of service to the people I love in this disaster setting? The next step up is people who realize there's a skill set. There are many skill sets I could actually start to take on. I'm doing this to like flex our muscles, to build our muscles, our skill sets of advanced level resilience skills. Those are the practices of reconnection. And then the final of the third of the steps in this model is people who consistently, it's in my experience and many of the people who do this work, as they sincerely take on these practices of reconnection to connect themselves with their families, with their neighborhoods, with themselves, and so on, they start to get an inkling of this third and final realm, which I call the transformative. It's very difficult to describe to somebody who hasn't experienced it, but you start to get a taste of it when you do sincerely do these practices of reconnection that you put together for yourself. And it is there that we get just a brilliant response to the question, if not the fear and the despair and freaking out, then what? In the transformative, and actually it starts to show up in those advanced practices of reconnection. There are just magical amounts of connection with the people we love, connection with our neighbors, connection with our deeper self, and the inner resources that we have that we didn't even know about.
How does this change your life?
It has changed my life because it's consistent with practices that I've done since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's literally saved my life, because I came from a very troubled background, like alcoholic parents and lots of trouble in the neighborhood kind of thing. And it has consistently given me what many of the contemplative practices give to people around the world, is that ability to be more and more present in the face of larger and larger stressors. That's really a core phrase we use a lot in this work, which is, I may not see something out on the horizon that's any good. There's really not much to hope for in terms of this way that we do this human operating system. It's ecocidal. But that we project, that I see that kind of a projected outcome out on the horizon. And at scale, I can't change that. What I can change is my ability to be absolutely as present as possible in the face of those circumstances.
You and I were talking about that before we went on the air. I was telling you that lately I have felt more and more centrifugal force as things spin faster and faster.
Yeah.
There's a centrifugal force sort of blowing my equanimity out to the margins, and I'm finding it harder to sort of keep it together, as it were. And for me, it's like I have to let go. It's like I have to give up the illusion that I can hold on to all of this and somehow instead surf the wave. But that requires a completely different attitude than we're sort of trained to, or I have been trained to do, which is understand things, grasp them,
yes,
put them in order. I don't think that's going to work very much going forward.
Yeah, clearly it's not. I really appreciated your honesty in describing that before we got going, and again now. And I agree. Our world is set up to keep us off center for a number of reasons that go beyond the time we have to talk about it today. But all that really matters, again, it's just practices of reconnection. And part of that is our reconnection with our deeper self, is a reconnection with our ability to bring ourselves back to center when life comes along and knocks us off center. As the famous human potential speaker Mike Tyson likes to say, everybody's got a plan till you get punched in the face. That's his way of saying the hurricane comes and decimates your neighborhood. And how will you stay present, or how will you bring yourself back to presence so that you can be of service to the people you love?
And how do we do that?
Well, for me personally, I can speak to my own practices, and each person's practices are different in the circles of support that I offer. My practices are, I have a number of different ways through the contemplative type of practices, the meditation and different ways of calming my system down when I feel spun out, that spinning that you were talking about. I have ways to slow that down so that I can bring my focus back to something more familiar, where I can feel like I've got a sense of grounding and home in my own system. Without that, I sure have had my share of being spun out, having that experience you're describing as just one of the ways we can be knocked off center. So I have a number of practices that bring me back to center. There are a number of other practices that are, again, like building those muscles of presence beyond the just returning to center, like expanding my capacity to be present. That can involve a number of different practices from, well, there are a number of that are involved more subtle awareness of how my system operates. And without getting too esoteric about it, I think all of us have a sense of we can sense that there's an energetic reality going on in any situation, whether I'm alone, with one other person, in a room full of people, and certainly on the larger scale, the national scale. Like the energetics of the USA is just out the roof insane. It's spinning like you were describing at scale. It's mind-boggling.
So it's a question of how people feel toward each other and toward themselves. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's one way we can sort of get a sense of, we can get a read, like what the expression "read the room."
Mm-hmm.
You read the room in most American conversations right now, and it's not a pretty sight. People are not getting along.
No, I agree. People are freaking out.
They're also very unable. Most people don't have the ability to reclaim their center in a conversation. So before you know it, within moments, it's possible to have an argument set up, and polarization and aggression and so on. It takes something to be able to create something other than that. So it's part of the skill set. And I don't think I'm doing a very good job of answering your question,
Well,
which is,
that's all right.
what do you do?
Yeah, well, it starts with the intention, though, doesn't it? Because a lot of Americans, not Americans alone, but particularly, they don't intend to come back to center. They aren't trying to make a connection. It's about confrontation. It's about domination and power over.
Yes.
So it seems like a first step is we need to choose to intend to both come to center and make a connection.
I couldn't have said it better. That's really brilliant. It is, without naming it, in our own system and in the energy of the reading the room around us, in the other people and so on. You're right. There is no starting point until we come to that basic awareness.
But if we do have that intention, then there are things we can do, I guess, to help ourselves. Yes. I've heard a lot about breathing, that a good place to start is breathing.
Yes.
Like I've done the square breathing exercise.
Yeah.
Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4, etc. And that somehow triggers one of the nervous systems, the parasympathetic, or one of them, I'm not sure, and calms you down. It tells your amygdala that you're not under immediate threat, that the fight or flight impulse doesn't need to be fully activated right this second.
Yeah.
Is that part of the arsenal?
Absolutely. And that's a perfect fit for what I was describing as the first aid level. And while I was describing as a progression into the practices of reconnection, and then the most advanced of all, the transformative, we all need those basic skills you're describing. And there is no more essential starting point than breath. You've just hit it and said it really beautifully. And that 4 by 4 by 4 and so on, breathing, it just doesn't get more essential, like a cornerstone way of, the kind of technical term for it is self-regulation or co-regulation. So self-regulation is obvious. That's what I would be doing to bring myself back to center. But co-regulation is what you and I might do in a meeting, or when we get together and we both realize, damn, we're both spun out right now. Mm-hmm. And so there are many of those kind of cornerstone basics that I just can't stress strongly enough, that those are core skills for these times and for all the future I can see out ahead of us. Sure. So I really appreciate you bringing up that example of how essential those cornerstone first aid level co-regulation and self-regulation skills are. And that's how we hold them in the work that I'm trying to describe. Yeah.
So when you talk about building capacity, you said that a couple of times. What kind of strength are you trying to build?
Essentially, it's to be less and less fragile. There's a kind of an odd term that comes from a community in the loosely affiliated community around the world, very, very bright people working on sense making in these times. And one of the terms that they've come up with is they start with the assertion that this business as usual culture around the world is extraordinarily fragile. We've seen that in the COVID time, that how to stop supply chains and elements of the system, it's extraordinarily fragile as a system. There's a word that they come up with to sort of address that and talk about, if not that, then what, that they call anti-fragility or anti-fragile. And that's one way of looking at the larger and larger systemic view of what do we need to be doing so that we can have more aliveness instead of more reaction, have more connection instead of more of, I love the way you said it, that we just seem right now to be in this knee-jerk reaction constantly with one another. It's just it's already post-fragile. It's shattered before we even get talking.
It sounds like you're talking, maybe, let me ask, about accessing the spontaneity of a natural human reaction to other people. Or rather than going into the reflexes and the ruts and grooves that have been cut by business as usual, instead of that, having access to a spontaneous response, a presence in the moment that we can then bring to bear and dwell in our relations with ourselves and other people, the world, and the divine.
Yeah, it's lovely the way you just said that. And I guess I would suggest to your listeners, it's likely that folks who would be listening to this this offering would already have some resources, inner resources that they can call on to bring themselves back to that self-regulated state, to that center. And so the question is, if I'm not in freak out and fear and spun out and so on, like we've been talking about, then what? And I love the words you were using about that spontaneous, authentic expression and presence is, if not that, then what? That's a great aspirational state. And so I would ask all of us to look at what are my resources that I already have in place to do that. And how interested am I to expand my capacity and ability to be able to be more and more present in the face of larger and larger stressors. And that's a skill set that I think is worth building for the rest of our life. The more I do that, the more I can be of service to the people I love.
It sounds like really you have a lot of faith in humanity, that despite the track record, the historical record we see of human civilization building its own disaster, still at the center of each human being is this opportunity for goodness, is not really the word, but presence or centeredness, authenticity, compassion. Compassion is a word I hear used a lot, compassion and wisdom. Mm-hmm. Do those reflect in your work?
I thank you for what you're saying, and I believe that most of those pieces are in place in how I see the world and see myself in it. I don't have any hope for our world. I have extraordinarily little, and I don't have much regard for the word hope, and that's a whole nother conversation. And you said about faith, I I also don't know really how to describe that, how to define it, and that could be a longer conversation itself. What I hear is the essence of your question. It seems consistent no matter where I've been in the world, no matter what level of socioeconomic level people are. It seems like there are essential elements that you and I are talking about in that expansion of capacity to be present. All of us have an essence, an essential experience of what matters most to us.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some desire, if we may not be conscious of it. Most people, I think, aren't these days because of that spin you were talking about before. But when we get quiet, when we really calm down and really look at what matters most to us and how could we possibly be in greater contact with that core, with what matters most, it starts to become apparent. I would like more of that. I've been in countless conversations where no matter where we are on the political spectrum, we can both absolutely end up in alignment with, yes, we both have things that matter most to us. We both want more of that experience with people we love and things we love in life. So there's this remarkably peaceful, rich place where you and I can connect rather than that adversarial stuff that you were describing before that we're all present to every day.
Mm-hmm.
There is an alternative. So that I have faith in. I don't have hope even about that. But what I do have immense faith in is no matter what I'm seeing out on the horizon, no matter how soon massive collapse might happen or not, I do have faith that you and I can find that place where we can sit together and have that shared experience, that very deep shared experience.
Kind of like today.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is an instance. It's an
Mhm.
instance of it.
Yes.
Have you found that your practice and teaching and work with other people has improved your life? Do you feel better now than when you started?
I'm going to get moved here. I'm deeply grateful for this work, the privilege of doing this work with people, because it's all about touching this place, that core place that I was just mentioning, and the place that you and I are touching into together today. And so it's an extension of my practices that I've had for my whole life. It has deepened and broadened because I never imagined that it would be on a global scale. I had no idea it would go to this level. And so, yes, I am grateful. It is immensely valuable. I don't know of anything more core or more universally valuable to be doing than these practices of reconnection, these ways of coming together and finding that common ground where that kind of richness can show up of our own shared presence.
I sense in what you say an invitation to people. You are asking people to take a step or make a decision or a choice or choose a path. In the last few minutes of our conversation here, could you describe that invitation or elaborate on it and make it explicit so people know what you're really asking for?
Yeah. Well, in all the aspects of my work, the podcast, which is called The Poetry of Predicament, it's a YouTube channel. In the online resources and learning series, and then the support groups and so on, the opportunity is the same in every one of those. And that's for a person to be exactly where they are. There are going to be some people who stay at the level of first aid level resilience skills that I was talking about a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they want to stay. And I have no interest in pushing someone to some other level or trying to have some, convince them of some point of view or some direction to go. That's not what this is about. The invitation that I hear you asking about is to invite people to find the level of practices that I've been talking about, find the level that works for them, and then to be of service as best I can to offer a menu, a rich menu from which they can choose their own practices. And then if it works for them, they can choose to be in circle with others. And your practices will be different than mine, but we can support one another in the elements that we cannot do on our own. For instance, grieving is just, it mostly cannot be done alone, as I would assert. And shadow work, which is a part of those kind of advanced levels, there are parts by definition of my own shadow that I can't see. And I know I would learn these ways to identify when my shadow is acting up. And I could ask of sitting in the circle with you and others, I could say, I need some help seeing my shadow and working this out. So the invitation is to, whether it's in my work or elsewhere, for people to find and name the level they're at in terms of truth-telling, capacity for actually seeing what's going on and seeing what's true about their own capacity to be present, and expand those capacities to whatever degree is right for them. That's what the invitation is.
Thank you, Dean. It's been very nice talking to you. This is Dean Walker, livingresilience.net. I'm David Baum in Seattle. This is Collapse Club. Nice to see you, and thank you for joining me, Dean.
David, I love this idea that you put together. Thank you so much for including me.
Until we meet again, farewell.